so many things that we think about every day can be used as either a tool or a weapon. This has been true of so many technologies over time, and digital technology is in so many ways potentially a formidable weapon.
Hi there, Alex Clement here of GZERO Media. I'm in for Ian Bremmer this week on a special edition of the GZERO World podcast. Today I'll sit down with Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, to talk about his new book on the promise and perils of the technologies that shape our lives. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
Artificial intelligence, big data analysis, facial recognition, social media. New technologies that thrive on data have brought great promise and benefits to our lives, to our health, to our economies, and to our standards of living. But they also pose grave new threats to our privacy, our jobs, our national security, and even to our democracy. Few people are as keenly attuned to these challenges or as involved in trying to sort them out as our guest today, Brad Smith. He is the president of Microsoft, you may have heard of it, and the author, with Microsoft's senior director Carol Ann Brown, of a timely new book called Tools and Weapons, The Promise and Peril of the Digital Age. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let's start off with this idea of tools and weapons. How should we think about the distinction between what makes something a tool and what makes it a weapon, and how that applies to the technologies of today?
One of our points is that so many things that we think about every day can be used as either a tool or a weapon. Take a broom. We can use it to sweep the floor. Somebody can use it to hit somebody over the head. This has been true of so many technologies over time. Benjamin Franklin created the Postal Service in the United States, and criminals turned that into a vehicle for mail fraud. The telegraph became a tool for wire fraud, as did the telephone. Digital technology is in so many ways more ubiquitous and more powerful than these other tools. That also makes it potentially a much more formidable weapon as well. We've seen malware become prolific in its most extreme form. We've seen it used as a weapon by governments. The so-called WannaCry attack in 2017, just 2 years ago. In one day, North Korea used that to disable 300,000 computers in more than 150 countries. No weapon in the history of military warfare had ever impacted that many countries with a single attack in a single day. Obviously, it didn't kill people the way other weapons might have, but no one would have thought in those terms a decade ago.
And when it comes to sorting out whether a technology will be a tool or a weapon, who's in the best position to sort that out? Who decides whether it turns out to be a tool or a weapon?
The great challenge here is at one level, anybody can. Any individual can turn a tool into a weapon, just as you could turn a hammer from a tool into a weapon. And we're seeing individuals do that in the context of, say, criminal activity. At the end of the day, there's probably two entities that will have more impact than anybody else. One is the companies that create this technology. To the extent that we do a good job of anticipating the adverse impacts, we can do more to try to address it. And then ultimately, it is the government. It is the government that is uniquely in a position to decide whether something needs to be treated as an opportunity or a challenge, whether it should be left to the market alone or whether it should be regulated as well.
So let's talk about that question of regulation. Obviously, that's very much on people's minds these days, particularly in the United States. We're starting to see a kind of bipartisan consensus around the idea that there should be greater regulation of the tech sector. What's your view on what should be regulated and how? What is the government's role here?
Well, one premise in our book, which we talk about, is the time has come for government to play a more active role. In so many interesting ways, if you look at the history of technology, information or digital technology has gone more decades without being regulated than almost any similar technology before, whether you're talking about the telephone or electricity or the automobile or the airplane. And in many ways, it hasn't really even been subjected to intense self-regulation. We've had a very laissez-faire approach to this. Now it is ubiquitous. It is powerful. It is changing our lives. And to think that we can solve the challenges that technology is creating without government playing a role, I think is simply misplaced.
One of the big debates at the moment is whether the government should impose stricter regulations on social media. But this broader question of the extent to which speech on the internet should or should not be policed and by whom, I mean, what's your view on that question?
I think your question is really one of the most interesting and in some ways important questions of our day. The U.S. Congress decided in the 1990s that, in effect, these interactive computer services, what became social media, would be given a regulatory pass. There would be created an exemption from the normal legal liability rules that apply to, say, other forms of publications like newspapers, radio, television. It was essential at the time. It is necessary to a substantial degree even today, I would argue. So we sort of have two extremes, a world where there's complete legal pass and a world where there are 20th century rules. I think we need a new way, a new middle path. It requires extraordinary thought. I think that the obligations that should be imposed should be precisely tailored. But already things are moving quickly in this direction. In the wake of the Christchurch terrorist attack from this March, we saw the Government of Australia act. We're seeing regulatory proposals advance in the United Kingdom, across Europe. We need to find the right balance to strike.
It will not have escaped your notice or that of our listeners that it doesn't seem to be a particularly propitious time for countries to work together or for parties to work together. Is this a problem that is impossible to solve given the global dynamics and the political dynamics that we see?
Unquestionably, we advocate sailing into the wind because we believe that the only way to address the technology issues of the world is for the world to work together. But I would also say that as we share in the book, we're actually sailing forward and are making some progress. The number one tool that we have in the 21st century that we didn't apply very often in the 20th century is diplomacy that is not only multilateral, but multi-stakeholder, meaning we're bringing governments and tech companies and other businesses and not-for-profits together. And that's what happened in Paris last November with what became called the Paris Call to address cybersecurity challenges, including the protection of elections. It is what happened this year with what's called the Christchurch Call to address digital safety.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because I think one of the interesting things about how cybersecurity has changed, or the challenges have changed in recent years, is that it used to be that hackers were sort of lone wolf types sitting in a basement and sort of hacking into things for fun. Now hackers have the backing of nation states and entire intelligence services of nations. It seems like it would be an opportune time or an important time to get some rules around cyber warfare, and yet those don't exist, and it seems to be difficult to bring them into existence. Why is it so hard for the nations of the world to agree on a basic set of rules for cyber warfare?
Fundamentally, any time one is trying to impose arms limitations, as we describe in the book, it is a challenge, perhaps most especially for the nations that perceive themselves as having an advantage, a comparative advantage, by having more sophisticated weapons than other countries. And today in the cyber weapons space, that is true of the major military powers in the world. We see certain countries, as we describe explicitly in the book, particularly North Korea, Russia, Iran, making aggressive use of these weapons, it's not surprising that they would resist stronger rules. Now, at the same time, there are norms that exist today, and they're important. And they do have some critical influence on what happens in the world. We believe that it's possible to build on them, and some of the stories that we tell really go a bit behind the scenes in terms of what happened at the White House. For example, in 2017, over the course of 6 months in the wake of North Korea's WannaCry attack, it ultimately led 5 governments and 3 tech companies to come together in December of 2017 to publicly attribute the WannaCry attack to North Korea, and for the tech companies to take concrete steps to disable the malware capability of the specific North Korean group that was responsible. So we, again, have these challenges that are more pronounced than, I would argue, perhaps almost any time since the 1930s, with governments turning inwards, with this nationalism and populism sweeping around the world. And yet we are making some strides, and we need to keep focused on doing so. I think to some degree what happens in the world of technology is a reflection of what's happening more broadly. But we believe, as we describe at some length, that it's really important at one level to appreciate how technology works. People may think that they are buying a product that is an American product. If it's a hardware product, they're probably not surprised if they learn that it was in fact manufactured in China.
Like a smartphone or
exactly.
a tablet or a laptop. Yeah, okay.
These days, almost any piece of technology hardware has a fairly high probability of having been manufactured in part or in whole in China.
Whatever our listeners are using to listen to this podcast has probably been made in China.
There's a good chance of that.
Right.
What people don't necessarily appreciate, because we haven't talked as much as a technology community about it, is that a product that looks like it was invented in the United States, in fact, was probably invented with critical research advances in many places around the world. And these days, that almost certainly includes a number of researchers and engineers in China, as well as in India and the United Kingdom, Ireland, and many other places. But the basic point is, we're working at a time when I worry that there is a temptation in some quarters to try to create a new digital Iron Curtain down the middle of the Pacific. And yet, as we explain in the book, that is not likely to be possible. Even if it were possible, it would probably do more to hold back a country like the United States if it were to pursue such a path, because you would cut yourself off from critical research that would then be used to drive technology forward elsewhere.
I mean, you say that it would be impossible to actually draw a digital Iron Curtain down the Pacific. What is the risk that we see in people trying to do that? What's the negative outcome here if we continue on this path of increasing divergence between the U.S. and China?
I think that, among other things, there is a risk that the U.S. government, in trying to protect American technology, will in fact weaken it. Technology is global. It operates in a global market. It is designed to work the same way everywhere, and it is designed to connect people around the world. And so, if you try to limit its export with rules that are not well designed for the 2020s, or you simply try to prevent American technology from going to other places, you create the risk that the U.S. technology sector will become less successful because they won't succeed on a global basis, which is almost the only real definition of success.
One of the areas that China is making a big play in, of course, is in artificial intelligence. And the section of your book that deals with artificial intelligence focuses a lot on the ethical considerations. What are the big ethical challenges with artificial intelligence as you see them?
I think at the end of the day, if there is a single issue that is perhaps the most fundamental for the next decade and for our generation on this planet, it's whether machines will continue to be accountable to people. We now have the ability to create machines that can make decisions by themselves. I think it's of fundamental importance that we ensure that machines remain accountable to people and that the people who create these machines remain accountable to the public at large. Those are really, fundamental ethical challenges for the world of technology, especially in a new era of AI.
When we talk about AI, there's a lot of concern about jobs that will be lost or jobs will be replaced by computers. What, in your view, do the pessimists get wrong about AI, and what, in your view, do the optimists get wrong?
That's why we take on this issue, in the book itself very directly. And I think your question frames it very well. I think what the pessimists get wrong is two things. One is that AI will create jobs as well as change and displace or destroy some jobs. And one of the things that is really important is to start to think about where new jobs are likely to be created. And then most importantly, perhaps, what skills will be needed by people to go after these jobs and for businesses to pursue them. And we talk some about some of the areas where we're seeing that emerge. And of course, where the optimists are too optimistic, in our view, is to think that it will all work out just fine. We look in the book to two fundamental tools, if you will, to try to help us all, and especially readers, think about where jobs are going. One is to just understand a little bit more about how AI works and what AI can do well, because AI, by definition, will impact jobs if the jobs involve tasks that AI can do well. That's why one of the stories we tell is thinking about the person that you talk to if you're going through a drive-through of a fast food restaurant. What does that person do? Literally, all they do is listen to what you say and enter it into a computer. With AI being able to understand speech, the computer can do that without a person. That's a job that is a top candidate for displacement. And by the same token, there are many things that AI can't do well, especially things that involve more soft skills and empathy, where jobs are less likely to be displaced. But the other great source of insight, in our view, certainly for the impact of jobs, more broadly throughout the book, is really learning from history. This is not something that we've tended to connect with the tech sector by and large, and yet it is such a deep source of learning. And we spend a little more time, for example, in the book talking about how the economy transitioned from the horse to the automobile and how in the long run that created more jobs than it destroyed. But the long run took 4 decades. And halfway through that 4 decades, we were in the middle of the Great Depression. And frankly, one of the reasons we were in the middle of the Great Depression, as we describe in the book, is because of the indirect negative economic effects of the demise of the horse and an entire economy that had been built to some degree around a horse-centered era. And so we need to think through all of these things, but by understanding them better, I think we equip ourselves to anticipate the challenges we're going to be facing over the next decade.
I'm glad you mentioned the historical aspect, because I think one of the interesting things about the book is the extent to which you look at how the current challenges of technological displacement and upheaval compare to earlier ones. And I was thinking about this recently. You may have seen the HBO series Chernobyl, which everyone is talking about. There are a few examples that I can think of, a technology that can be both so much a tool and quite literally a weapon as atomic energy, right? So I guess the question I have is, how should we think about digital technology as something different?
At one level, there are specific dimensions of digital technology that find important parallels in a variety of different technologies over time. The impact societally of, say, the automobile, or the economically and politically the railroad. And at another level, I would say, if you want to think about a technology that was as ubiquitous and universally impactful as digital technology, you have to think about electricity because it ended up fueling everything. It's a mistake to think that the future is going to unfold exactly like the past. No one thing is exactly like another thing. But the key point is there are insights that can be drawn. And in many ways, I'd even talk about nuclear power and Chernobyl specifically. I think that there was an extraordinary insight that actually came out of that recent show. Think about the fundamental problem that was created for nuclear power in Russia because of an absence of transparency. And then you think about this new technology, and you therefore are compelled, I believe, to focus on the critical importance of transparency and, frankly, rules that will compel the use of this technology, to some degree the development of this technology, to be transparent. Without an ability to understand how technology is working, almost nothing else is possible, and people's lives can be at stake. Witness Chernobyl.
One of the themes that comes up that I find interesting is this idea of whether these new technologies, which were originally thought of as great democratizing forces and great for civil society and all of these things, whether what we've seen over the past several years with the way that social media has contributed to polarization in democracies, but also data has given authoritarian regimes more levers of control over their populations.
Technology, especially over the last 5 years, has emerged as a weapon that, as we point out in the book, has probably benefited authoritarian regimes in an asymmetric way. The Stasi regime in East Germany went to incredible lengths to spy on the population. If people can read Facebook pages, their job just got a lot easier. They would have loved it.
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah. It's just so that part is distinct. But I think even more than that, technology is being used to spread disinformation in a way that is not qualitatively perhaps different from what certain authoritarian regimes have sought to do for many decades. But, oh my gosh, it is a quantum leap in terms of capability and speed. I mean, for a group in St. Petersburg to organize a protest and counter-protest in the United States with literally neighbors yelling at neighbors with neither one of them for a moment knowing or even suspecting that this whole issue had been fomented thousands of miles away. That is a different world.
We've talked about what the responsibility of a firm like Microsoft is in a democratic society and working with the government to regulate things. But as tech firms increasingly get drawn into these geopolitical conflicts between authoritarian states and democracies or between authoritarian states and each other, how does a firm like Microsoft or a tech firm in general position itself? What are your responsibilities in dealing with authoritarian governments, I guess is my question.
I think that is one of the most important issues in the technology sector today. We don't believe, as it's clear in the book, that it's really possible for a company to just be agnostic, to say, hey, just create technology. I'm not responsible for how it's being used. I think we have to be principled. We argue strongly for standing up for the protection of human rights, for knowing when to say no to the deployment of facial recognition technology so that it's not used to pursue mass surveillance, knowing when to say no about putting citizen data or consumer data in a data center in a country where it can be accessed and used to prosecute, persecute, or on the worst days, execute individuals for simply pursuing the legitimate course of human rights.
Early in the book, you say that a principle for how to make decisions should be, what will people think of this decision 10 years from now, or words to that effect. Let's fast forward 10 years and look back at 2019. What do you think the verdict is on how companies are dealing with these questions of privacy and security? And what right now are we getting wrong that you think we need to address?
In many ways, I think 2019 is the first year of the 2020s. The next decade has just begun in the sense that the alarm clock has gone off. We have awakened. We've looked out the window, and we've discovered that it is a different world. There is 25 times as much digital data on this planet as there was a decade ago, and that's just the beginning of the digital and data explosion that we'll see. We're seeing, computers be able to understand what people say, to be able to see through cameras and understand and interpret their images in a car. We can now, I think, discern some of the broad trends that lie ahead. And so I think we'll look back and say, okay, we woke up. Now the question is, it's a new day. What are we going to do with this knowledge? And the truth is, you can't judge a day typically based on what happened in the first hour of the morning. It's all about what you do throughout the rest of the day.
But what's the one thing that worries you most that you don't think is being addressed?
Well, the one thing that worries me the most is that democracies, the democratic republics of the world, will find it too hard to make decisions for themselves and find it impossible to work together. These decisions require effective coordination. That is critical in the cybersecurity space. Cyber weapons are going to continue to become more powerful over the next decade. AI is going to just guarantee that. So if I take something like cybersecurity or something like privacy, it is just so clear that these issues are going to just become bigger and bigger over the next decade. And this is the proverbial, genie. As the genie gets farther away from the bottle, it gets a lot harder to put it back in, which is why in many ways we wrote this book as a call to action to say, look, let's get started. The worst thing we could do is say, we don't yet have all the answers. Let's spend 10 years learning more and thinking about it. We can't afford to wait a decade before addressing the problems that will define the decade ahead. And let's recognize the political reality, the geopolitical reality. It would be naive to think that, we're going to see governments, turn up to create, the next amendment to the United Nations Charter. But we do have companies that can act globally, nonprofits, civil society that can act globally, and some governments that are prepared to act globally. Let's build a coalition of the willing. Let's create the models for the future. And then as they take hold, we can always get more people to sign on. I think being politically realistic, we're looking over the near term at leadership in other countries and then trying to persuade the U.S. to be supportive rather than what we would have done at some points in the past and expect the U.S. government to be the leader for the world. It makes everything harder. That's one of the challenges in our view. And that's not to take away from the need for important bilateral negotiations that are hard-headed and maybe even on certain days tough-edged. But technology is a global phenomenon. It cannot be addressed satisfactorily through a series of bilateral discussions. We need global initiatives. And ironically, and in my view, unfortunately, we have certain American companies trying to do more to promote these multilateral and multi-stakeholder approaches without the backing of our own government. But the fact that we can make headway on these days gives me great hope ultimately for the future when the pendulum swings back, as I believe it inevitably will, to the U.S. government getting off the sidelines and getting more in the game.
Ending on an optimistic note.
There are challenges, but there is cause for optimism.
Brad Smith, president of Microsoft and author of the new book, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age, which he wrote with Carol Ann Brown, senior director at Microsoft. Brad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. We'll be right back here next week, same place, same time, unless you're watching on social media, in which case it's wherever you happen to be. Don't miss it. In the meantime, check us out at gzeromedia.com.
The The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.